Hello, my name is David Sanderson, and welcome to the first in a series of 3 Urbanisation at Risk Meet the Authors webinars being held jointly by UNSW's Grand Challenges and the Institute for Global Development, also at UNSW. The title of this webinar is Lessons from Tropical Cyclone Winston in Fiji. But before we start, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Bedegal people that are the traditional custodians of this land. I would also like to pay my respects to the elders, both past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who may be joining us today. This event is being recorded and will be made available afterwards. This webinar series springs from a recently released edited book, Urbanisation at Risk in the Pacific and Asia, which explores the intersection of rapid urbanisation and disasters, many of which are fueled by climate change. In these webinars, we'll be meeting some of the authors who wrote contributing chapters. The idea is to hear about their current, their future work, of course, to talk about the chapter, but of course, you can read that in the book, but also to learn more about what makes them tick. This is, after all, about meeting the authors. If you have any questions, please add those at any time in the chat, and I'll try to get to them and get through as many as I can in the hour that we have. So I'd like to welcome our 2 authors, Gero and Keren Winterford, who both work at the Institute for Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology here in Sydney at UTS. Gero is research principal at the Institute. She has extensive experience working in Asia Pacific, looking in particular on climate change, disaster risk reduction and development. Keren Winterford is research director at the Institute. She also has extensive experience working in the Pacific on climate change and development with NGOs and a whole host of other actors. So Keren, hello, and it's a real pleasure to have you join us today for this webinar.
Thanks for having us, David. Thanks, it's going to be a great session, thanks.
Well, it's a real pleasure having you here. The chapter you wrote for the book is called The Humanitarian Development Nexus in Pacific Urban Contexts, Lessons from Tropical Cyclone Winston in Fiji, which of course was an especially devastating event. Anna, perhaps turning to you first, can you tell us a little bit of what's in the chapter, any particular findings, any insights, any surprises?
Sure, yeah, I would be happy to. So the chapter explores Tropical Cyclone Winston, which, as you mentioned, it was a very severe event that affected Fiji in particular. It was Category 5, the highest category cyclone. I think at the time it was the most intense cyclone recorded in the South Pacific. With really severe wind and rain affecting a huge proportion of the Fiji community. So our chapter explores this idea of the humanitarian development divide. So we know that there are certain actors and certain ways of working that are around humanitarian and disaster response, and there are sort of different ways of working and different set of actors and funding streams and language and terminology around sort of development in general. And what we've sort of seen over the years and what other academics and practitioners have seen over the years is that there's a real divide between those 2 communities. And that can lead to sort of disjointed and disconnected efforts when a disaster or humanitarian response ends and sort of recovery and rehabilitation start. They're often disconnected from long-term development goals. So our research explored this idea of the humanitarian development nexus and the humanitarian development divide that I've just explained in the context of Tropical Cyclone Winston. And we chose Fiji and Cyclone Winston, and in particular the western division of Fiji. So Fiji's set its administrative divisions. We've got central, northern, western and eastern. And so our research looked at the western division, which was particularly affected by Tropical Cyclone Winston. And we worked with the divisional government to really understand what happened with the Cyclone Winston response. Did it contribute to long-term development goals, or was it disconnected, as is the case in a lot of other disaster response and humanitarian response efforts? And what we found was there was a disconnect, which isn't surprising, as I've just mentioned. But what we found was there was certainly a really strong appetite, and there was already the foundations to overcome that divide. And one of the really interesting findings that I'd like to describe is how that took place. And so in times of disaster in Fiji, the governance arrangements are that the divisional commissioners, so that the government leaders for each division are assigned with the responsibility for leading the response in their division. So looking after and taking charge across all the different line ministries and everything that happens for disaster response in their division. It's the divisional commissioner who is responsible for that disaster response effort. And given that role that he played, he knew about the development goals of the Western Division already, because that was his role outside of disaster times. So him and his the people that worked for him, they sort of changed their hats from being, working in line ministries and working in community development to then working in disaster response. So given it was the same personnel, the same people who were then responsible for disaster response, they had this understanding of what the community needed in terms of their development priorities. And that was a really interesting finding, because it showed that there was that really strong connection between development and the disaster response. So that was one really interesting finding that I think the listeners might be interested in, and yeah, happy to hand over to the next question.
Fantastic. Well, maybe I can ask you, Anna, sticking with you, a follow-up to that. And your chapter really clearly describes the separation and the efforts over the decades of linking relief, recovery and development and all those things, and some of the strengths and weaknesses we see in that. And the word, as we know, these last few years, the nexus, the bringing together of these two things. Maybe I can ask you, Anna, why does it matter? Surely disasters, we need firefighters when there's a fire. Why does it matter? And if it matters, are we getting better at it or getting worse?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the issue of climate change helps to kind of think about why that matters. So an example might be in the Cyclone Winston response. There were numerous sort of infrastructure that was damaged. Say a bridge was washed away, and this is not an exact example that happened in practice, but just an example that helps to answer your question. So let's say Cyclone Winston washed a bridge away, and the divisional commissioner had already planned that bridge was already actually quite vulnerable, because sea level rise and coastal erosion was making that bridge vulnerable. So there were already sort of plans to consider relocating that bridge. If we don't think about those long-term development goals and priorities at the time of disaster response and recovery, that bridge is going to be rebuilt in exactly the same position, because it's about urgency and it's about making sure that people can access the town and the market to get their kids to school and to get to work and to get to the hospital. So without thinking about long-term development, it's just about rebuilding that bridge right where it was. But if we think about those long-term development goals, then we need to think about, well, actually, at the time of rebuilding the bridge, let's consider rebuilding the bridge perhaps upstream, or incorporating rehabilitating the riverbank at the same time, like thinking about the environmental considerations as well. So yeah, we need to think about the long-term development to ensure that the bridge isn't washed away again in the next cyclone, and that people are able to continue to use these pieces of really important infrastructure that cost a lot of money. So, you know, there's issues around cost effectiveness and efficiency as well.
Maybe, thank you for that, Anna. Maybe turning to you, Keren. Surely the emergency people know that. What's wrong with them?
Well, I think that, I think that especially in the Pacific and even in relation to the COVID response, I think we're starting to see the value of thinking about, long-term development, or what was described by stakeholders in Fiji as like the peacetime versus the humanitarian response. And I think for me, what's been really interesting is the findings that we had from this research, which was conducted, it was 2017, I think we did this research. It was a long time ago, but it still keeps resonating. So something for me, which is really interesting, is the Australian response to COVID and that humanitarian response. And so if you think about what happened with the formation of the National Cabinet, so now we have the Prime Minister and all the premiers coming together, and it's a national response to COVID. And that was seen as being functioning really well. And so now what they've done is decided COAG, which was the previous ways of bringing together the states and the federal government, they sort of said, well, actually, that's it's not working well. It's dysfunctional. It's, you know, it's kind of full of bureaucracy. Let's get rid of that. And now let's put in place this national cabinet. So what I found interesting is kind of the peacetime COAG governance structure versus the COVID response kind of humanitarian structure, which is this national cabinet. Yeah, the national cabinet, the kind of humanitarian response has usurped that peacetime governance response. And that's what we heard in Fiji when we went to Fiji and we spoke with the government as well as the civil society sector in that Western Division. We asked them, what did you prefer? Did you prefer the governance arrangements under the TC Winston? As Anna said, you know, it became a very coordinated, solidified, unified action versus how it was before or how it was after TC Winston. And they said, actually, we prefer the kind of coordinated management response that we had under TC Winston. So, you know, people kind of know what works well and what is good, but somehow, you know, it doesn't necessarily work. What they enjoyed about that coordinated approach was that they could go down to the community, you know, in a clear, coordinated fashion. So what happens often within development planning, the health ministry go to the community one week, and then it's education another week, social welfare another week, and, you know, the community is just kind of engaged with these rolling sort of activities from different line ministries, whereas, you know, through this coordinated response, they went as a group to work with the community and support them. So I think there is awareness about what is working and what doesn't, but somehow the governance structures are sometimes hard to change.
I'd like to ask you about COVID in a moment, but just sticking to Tropical Cyclone Winston, some of the things that worked really well, you're saying coordination worked really well. So often a bugbear of evaluations is coordination was weak, but that was the special strength in the response.
Yeah. So what happens under the humanitarian response and the way that the kind of laws and arrangements are set in Fiji, and I'm no expert on it, so there's probably lots of other people on the line who might have more kind of technical language to speak to this, but essentially an emergency is called, and so this sort of emergency response governance structure comes in where the commissioners, so in Fiji they're made up of divisions, so the commissioner of the division is kind of in charge, so he's the kind of DM, what's the acronym, Anna?
NDMO, the National Disaster.
NDMO, there you go. So the NDMO, so he at that local level, at that Western Division level, at that divisional level, so it's a subnational level, he's responsible for the whole emergency response. And so everyone basically falls under his remit. And so he brings everyone together in a big boardroom meeting, and that's where we had our interviews during our research, and everyone was, you know, describing how it was to sit around this big boardroom and talk about, okay, what are we doing today? What are we doing tomorrow? What are we doing next week? And teams of NGOs, local government staff, Western Division staff, ministry staff would go together in sort of groups and go and work with the communities in that response. So they just really enjoyed it. And NGOs, you know, were at the table, they were sitting there, and they're often the ones that have strong relationships at the community level, and they were sitting there at the table and they were working with line ministries and working with the division office staff. And yeah, everyone really valued that kind of collegial, cooperative, coordinated function, and they said it actually worked better in the community because the community weren't kind of getting inundated with, you know, different types of response and different types of support.
And perhaps jumping to you, thank you for that, Keren. Perhaps jumping to you, Anna. We know the secret of good recovery very often is communities and community people listening to communities. Very often agencies find it quite difficult to consult adequately. That's a perennial finding of evaluations. You found that communities were very much in the driving seat, if you like, of recovery?
I think like Keren mentioned, I wouldn't say driving seat, but I think they were well consulted. And the government, the subnational government that we were sort of partnering with on the research and working really closely to understand the situation, their role was to support communities to develop good disaster response sort of plans and to set up community structures with really well-defined roles and responsibilities to ensure that in the time of disaster people knew what to do and who to turn to. So the government had worked really hard, and NGOs had supported that as well, but it was sort of, a government program, I think, that was really aiming to support communities because, like you said, it's really important for communities themselves to know what to do in times of disaster. And I'd also like to note that at the time of our research, the National Humanitarian Policy, I don't think it was yet endorsed. It was very close to being endorsed. But since then, I've just checked, and the National Humanitarian Policy for Fiji has been endorsed, and it specifically mentions the role of the cluster system, which people probably may be familiar with. This is sort of the approach that the UN has supported, and some regions and some countries have taken that on to sort of build it into their national frameworks for disaster response, and Fiji has done that. And so Fiji has these clusters, for example, the health cluster, the infrastructure, the WASH, and different clusters to coordinate at times of disaster response, and also to hopefully be active outside of times of disaster response as well for the preparation and disaster preparedness type activities. And I was just reading through the humanitarian policy last night because, you know, as a researcher and a practitioner and academic in this space, of course, this is what we do on a Tuesday. But I was really interested to see that. I'll just read, like it says, we must change the way we do development and ensure development is sustainable. And this is in the humanitarian policy. So that really speaks to that idea of the humanitarian development divide, and the policy is really trying to address that and acknowledging that in times of humanitarian response and with the cluster system, sustainable development shouldn't be forgotten about. And so it is having those long-term goals, even in those really times of really urgent, when communities are really in need of having water connected and food provided and their shelters rebuilt. We can't forget, Fiji has acknowledged that they can't forget about those long-term goals, which I think is really commendable, and I think Australia could probably learn from that as well.
Of course. Maybe Keren, thank you. Maybe Keren, I could jump to you. And the theme of this series is urbanisation at risk, and we've put a question mark on the webinar series, although we omitted the question mark on the book cover, and we'll come to that. Surely disaster response is easier in cities. Your chapter was quite noticed some of the weaknesses, but surely there's everything there, all the skills are there, all the people are there. It should be easier, shouldn't it, to respond in cities?
Well, what we found, it was really interesting because our research, and we have, it's online as well. We have the book chapter, and obviously everyone has to read the book and buy the book. Have this research that we conducted, which then informed the book chapter, was funded by IIED, and online there's a policy brief that we presented, we prepared, which is only a couple of pages, so it's quite an easy read, and also a working paper. But what was interesting was that it was an urban focus research, but when we got there and we asked everyone about, the urban context, no one really wanted to talk about it. It was all about villages. And so in the Western Division, I think it's the second largest city in Fiji, Lautoka. The governance structure is so interesting because Lautoka has its own sort of city structure, which is outside the Commissioner Western structure and outside other sort of other structures as well. So they sort of sit on their own. And yes, they were quite effective in organising themselves as a small city, but it's a very small city. It's probably the size of, I don't know, Kempsey or something. I don't know, but it's quite small. What we saw was this, there's a lag, there's kind of a policy lag between between what happens in the villages and the focus, the Fiji government focus, and we've seen this also in other Pacific Island countries as well. The sort of focus is still on the village structure and the village government structure, and the cities actually sit under a separate ministry that doesn't necessarily connect with other ministries, and yeah, it's very sort of complicated and convoluted, but they actually they sit side by side in silo at that local level in terms of subnational, but then in the national level, they actually also sit very side by side. So there's not much kind of connection there at all.
And is that particularly a problem? Does it matter, do you think?
Oh no, I think it does, because urbanisation is very much growing in the Pacific, and so there's a lot of communities actually now living in the Pacific and in towns, in small towns, in peri-urban towns. There's a lot of informal settlements on the side of cities. So, for example, in Lautoka, there was an informal settlement that kind of wasn't necessarily serviced by Lautoka City Council because they were actually outside the boundary. But who was servicing them in terms of water and sanitation and waste collection, etc. So it becomes a huge equity issue, and even in Suva there's a lot of informal settlements as well. And so I think that, yeah, I think it is a real issue. And in terms of humanitarian response, often in those informal settlements, they don't have the social capital and they don't have the existing networks to respond like they would in a village setting where there's familial ties and existing sort of social capital and connections. So yeah, I think that if we ignore it at the peril, I think.
Absolutely. I'd like to turn this a little bit to focus on you, Keren, and you, Anna, if I may, and to ask you a little bit how you got into this. You both have a wealth of experience and expertise in the region. Perhaps Anna, starting with you, what drives you and what got you into this business?
Well, going way back to, I guess, my university studies, undergraduate, I did environmental science and atmospheric science and studied climate change. This was in the early 2000s when, you know, we already knew that climate change was going to be a big issue, and I just knew I wanted to be a part of that somehow and to try and be part of the positive response. And so that sort of drove my choice in university studies. And from there, I actually worked at an insurance company to help the company to incorporate climate and weather risk into their sort of policies, but also into their organisational practice. And it was at a time when the CEO of the very large insurer really understood it was not only a business risk, climate change was a business risk, but it was also something that needed to be embedded in the way that the company operated. After that, I sort of felt a little bit like I had itchy feet, so I took up a volunteer position with the Australian Volunteers Program and moved to Samoa in the Pacific for a position with the UNDP on climate change and disaster advisor. And so that was my first foray into the Pacific, beyond a short holiday in Vanuatu in my late teens, to actually living in the Pacific for a year and really starting to understand Pacific culture. But even after all these years and living and working there for so long, of course, I'm still learning as an outsider to the region. I'm very much still learning about the culture and the ways of life. But yeah, that was it was quite a turning point for me, I think, that year away. And I guess within the UN system as well, learning about the massive bureaucracy that use the UNDP, and yeah, really starting to develop a real love for the region. So from there, I actually came back and worked at UNSW for a year on a research grant, and that was looking at the integration of climate change and disaster risk reduction in the Pacific. And so continuing on my work that I did in Samoa. And yeah, after that, started up as a researcher at the Institute for Sustainable Futures, and brought with me that continuing love and desire to contribute to positive change around climate change in the Pacific. And so, yeah, I think that has a very strong tie to this piece of research and a lot of the work that I've done at the Institute.
And when we talk climate change, it is a bleak prospect, especially an existential threat to some islands in the next few years. If the worst predictions come to pass, what motivates you when it comes to working in an area? Do you see hope there?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think the climate justice angle, and as an Australian, you know, contributing to that terrible problem that is, you're right, it's an existential threat to Pacific Islanders. And I think that motivates me, knowing that as an Australian, we need to do a lot better on the domestic front, and as a sort of a partner to the region. So that's a strong motivator for me, and it's dire, but I'm not losing hope. I think we can learn so much from the resilience from the Pacific Islanders already. You know, they're often painted with this narrative of being vulnerable and remote and isolated, and that's not necessarily true. I think that if we shift that narrative to really appreciate that they are people living on small islands, but the ocean is part of their identity, and I think that's part of the driving force behind the whole Blue Pacific narrative that the Pacific Island Forum and the Pacific region as a whole are trying to push. That they are a really strong continent together, and the ocean is part of their identity, and the whole small island developing states kind of mentality and that language, I think, needs to shift, because it doesn't recognise the wealth of resources and resilience that is really innate in the Pacific Islanders and in their culture.
Yeah, and clearly you deeply regret leaving UNSW, so I'll take that as a given. And before moving to Keren, Keren, you have a mountain of experience. How did you get into this business, and what drove you to get involved?
Oh yeah, that's a good. I know. I think what drove me to get involved was just a early recognition of injustice, social injustice, and I think recognition of my own privilege. So I think I've been aware of my own privilege. I grew up in a very loving home, you know, kind of middle class. I didn't go to a private school, I went to a public school, but anyway, I felt very privileged to go to school and, you know, to have the love and support of my parents. And I think that I just kind of recognised my privilege quite early on, and wanted to do work in international development. So yeah, like I think I wanted to do this, yeah, before I left high school. I wanted to work in international development. So to be able to kind of know what you want to do, and then to actually be able to work in that, yeah, in the area is such a privilege. And I think for me, it's just to kind of do my little bit and to recognise, you know, it's a bit like the justice work that Anna recognises. What can my contribution be as a white woman from Australia, and how can I work in a way that translates people's experiences and shares that with people in power and decision makers, and hopefully influences change, you know, through the work that we do. Yeah, so that's what kind of drives me, is to kind of give voice to the people in this kind of way. And yeah, I've sort of worked, the only places I haven't worked, well, I haven't worked at UNSW yet, so, you know, there's still time. I haven't worked at DFAT, and I haven't worked for ACFID, but I've kind of worked, I worked with managing contractors, I've worked with NGOs, I've worked with, you know, in this research space, I've worked as an independent consultant, so I can kind of sort of see the realities of you know, the different parts of the sector and parts of the industry. Yeah, and I think that I've had I think that working in the Pacific was one of my earliest places that I worked at, and I think that that's shaped my thinking, and one of the kind of my, I don't know, whatever I call it, like a Teflon coat or whatever it is, it's like a pair of glasses or something, but it's taking a strengths-based approach. And I think that we can look at communities as vulnerabilities, as deficits, as places needing to be fixed, or we can look at them as resilient and as strong and, you know, culturally vibrant and historically rich, etc. And so one of the formative kind of experiences for me was a project that I did in the early, I was reflecting this morning, wasn't up reading last night, but I was walking at sunrise this morning thinking about today, and I was reflecting on, you know, that's like early 2000s is like, you know, 20 years ago, isn't it really? but we were doing a child protection project in Fiji, Vanuatu and Samoa, and so it's about, it was a DFAT funded project. It was 3 years, and it was seeking to reduce child abuse and neglect in Fiji, Vanuatu and Samoa. And what was really interesting was that we sort of had to flip. We were very intentional in flipping this kind of intervention, fixing the problem approach to taking what we were describing as a community-based primary prevention approach. It was really about sort of identifying and elevating and celebrating the existing values in the community, which were about loving and caring for children, and actually kind of exploring those with communities and encouraging people to take those actions, which they have been doing for thousands and thousands of years, and doing that. And it's actually surprising that that project has legacy, in that it was a 3-year project, then the activity was taken over by UNICEF, and now, just as part of the research, when we went to Fiji, I was interviewing a worker from the Department of Social Welfare, and this package that we developed, this community-based primary prevention approach, which is basically sort of like dialogue and conversations at a community level about how to love and care for your children. It's still being used by the Department of Social Welfare. So yeah, so for me to really take that kind of that approach, which inherently values what is working well and what is good in a place, and using that as a means to address any future problems, I think is really important.
Both, I know you started by mentioning justice, and then Keren, you mentioned injustice is what brought you into that. And I'm interested in what climate justice looks like. That approach, does it make a difference when you talk in those terms, adding the word justice? To Keren, maybe I could ask you that question.
Yeah, no, I think it does, because I think it's the kind of shared humanity that we have together, and it's also about responsibility as well. Like the crisis that is upon Pacific Islanders, is not their creation, and so we have to be, we just have to own up to that fact, and we have to be responsible with it, and then we have to work in a way that ensures that we take the actions that we can take to reduce our own impact on the environment and on people's, as well as support them in their own ownership and leadership of resilient, climate resilient activities as well. Yeah, no.
Sorry, go ahead, excuse me.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, if we just think that the problem's out there and then we can go and fix it, rather than thinking about what issue, our own reality and our own kind of responsibility, then I think that's a real concern.
And a cynic might say that makes us feel good, but does it make any difference?
Oh, I think it has to. Well, I think what's interesting is, just in terms of we know that changing our behaviours and practice does make a difference. Like in the COVID response, when we see that, air travel and car travel and stopping factories, etc. It does make a difference to the environment, and the scientists tell us that if we stop polluting, then we do have a chance of saving the planet and the people in the planet. So I think that we continually do have to take responsibility, and I think it does require adjustment for everyone.
Thank you. We're getting some questions from the live Q&A. I'd like to address a couple of those. Maybe jumping to you, Anna. It's addressed to both of you. But Anna, I could ask you, did you notice an increasing trend of people moving into Lautoka City after TC Winston?
Oh, thank you for the question. And it's not something we specifically explored through this piece of research, but I know that I've done some work outside of this research, and I'd say it would very likely be yes, because we know that other severe weather events and disasters elsewhere and climate change are one of the driving factors to urbanisation. So people from outer islands that might be living the more subsistence kind of traditional grow, eat, own food and fish, they are becoming less tenable because of climate change. So the fish are no longer where they once were. The tara is not growing because the rainfall patterns are changing. The fruit trees are getting destroyed with the severe storms, and so people aren't able to maintain those lifestyles anymore. And so that's driving. It's one of the driving forces behind the urbanisation pull in the Pacific. So I'd say yes, it would likely be the same for Cyclone Winston. That's a very good question.
I've got another question. I'm going to leave it to either you or Keren to decide who answers it. So we'll see what happens. So it's a great question. Other academic research recently concluded that, well, naturally triggered disasters were contributing to the erosion of democracy in some Pacific Island states, including Fiji. I'm interested in your, this is a question, I'm interested in your critique of this analysis and any examples of how to avoid such traps when moving on from disaster governance.
Yes, shall I start, Anna? And yeah. So I think what was interesting and what we described, I don't think we described it so much in the book, but in the research, was the governance structures around, you know, sort of the long-term development and then the response and the recovery. And what was interesting in Fiji was that, as I said before, under development, you have the line ministries and they're all responsible for education or health or agricultural activities, etc. And then the humanitarian response was managed by the NDMO, and that was kind of delegated down to the divisional level. And then the recovery was actually managed by, I think it was the ministry or the Ministry of like the Treasury. And so the funds that came into Fiji, and there was a lot of funds that came from international agencies, was then sort of managed by that one ministry. And so I think that that again was kind of a coalescing of sort of power and control within that ministry. And some of our stakeholders that we spoke with at the Western Division, they recognised that they were responsible for recovery, so education or health or agriculture. Those workers on the ground were responsible for recovery, moving back into kind of peacetime development. But they had no funds to do that, so the funds were kind of housed within the Treasury and then sort of delegated out to different line ministries. So I think that it has the potential for the checks and balances of all normal day governance to be kind of, a bit co-opted and perverted, I think. There was another aspect that I was going to mention, but I've forgotten. I'll let you add in, Anna.
Yeah, sure. Not a huge amount to add because it's not something that we, sort of the democracy angle, but I guess just to note that, like what I mentioned before about communities and being supported by subnational government and also NGOs to develop their own disaster response sort of structures, so that in times of disaster it's really clear who will be responsible for receiving perhaps the funds to distribute to the community and that kind of thing. And I suppose there is then the possibility for corruption and that kind of thing, but that's not something we explored. And also just to note that in Fiji there is the Indo-Fijians as part of the population, and the Itakai, the indigenous Fijians, and there's different governance structures at the community level for that as well. And so that again has the potential for things to kind of go awry, but it's not something that we explored for this piece of research, and I'd be really keen to extend my own knowledge and read up on that myself in the future. Yeah.
And a linked question of sorts, I suppose. What mechanisms were used to respond to the needs of those in informal settlements? Or were people in formal settlements, were they completely left out of relief efforts?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'll provide an answer, and Keren, you might like to jump in as well. What we found was they certainly weren't completely excluded, but what the government was really aware of, and I think Fiji is actually a bit more of one of the more progressive countries in the region in terms of recognising populations in informal settlements. So what we heard through the research was there was either plans to, or it had already, the city boundary to be informal settlement actually included within the city boundaries, because that way people within those informal settlements were included within the city boundaries such that they could receive the support of the government as well. So it was certainly not a completely excluded group of the population, because as I mentioned, Fiji has acknowledged that informal settlements are something that they need to address, and it was something that the government was working on in terms of policy and then in practice for the response. Keren, do you remember anything else from the research on that?
Yeah, no, that was basically it. What was interesting was that the government recognised that they were actually not meant to provide water, sanitation, waste management services to those informal settlements. Like, sort of by law, they were not allowed to, but they were doing that kind of illegally before Cyclone Winston, and also, you know, during and after, because they just saw that those people had needs and they wanted, you know, they couldn't not meet those needs. And then the local government was actually seeking to extend the city boundary of Lautoka, which meant that they could, you know, they could provide those provisions within the law. Yeah, there's a lot of acknowledgement of the importance of providing services to informal settlements.
Thank you. And then one more question, which actually turns quite neatly to the final third, if you like, of this webinar, which is thinking about the future. A question is, in what ways does urbanisation increase or decrease people's vulnerability to the effects of climate change in the Pacific? I know a lot of, it's just disappeared. Let me just jump back to it again. I know, and the questioner says, I know a lot of internal migrants tend to settle in informal settlements on marginal coastal lands. So what is that future, especially people in informal settlements and climate change? Keren, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, no, that is, it is a huge risk, because often those informal settlements are on places which don't have existing structures, and often they are, you know, compromised by seawater erosion or flooding, or, you know, they're not sort of places where people are actually living now. So they are often the most vulnerable to those climate events, which is there. What was the other part of the question? It's a long question.
Yeah, basically, does in what way does urbanisation increase or decrease people's vulnerability to the effects of climate change? It's a great question, because of course the theme of this whole thing is urbanisation at risk.
Yeah. I think another element of that is also, you know, what we're seeing in terms of food security, and employment opportunities and decent work, etc. And so where people are vulnerable to their houses being destroyed, that can often, you know, that's like a vicious cycle where you're spending all your money on repairing your house, where you don't have decent work, you don't have decent work conditions or rights or opportunities. That's often, you know, that's a very compromising as well. And also then, you know, in terms of how that relates to food security, like food security is also, you know, a big issue for people that do live, you know, in villages and do grow crops themselves. But yeah, there's a whole sort of, the supply chain can cause people distress as well, like in terms of urbanisation as well. Anna?
Yeah. Just to link back to you know, what we've mentioned earlier in terms of the fact that climate change is continually pushing people from outer islands to urban centres. So we have this constant flow of people moving in, and also what Keren mentioned earlier about the urban policy lag. So there's already you know, a lag in terms of urban policy to deal not only with disaster response but other issues as well. So it's going to continue to kind of ramp up and need addressing. And Pacific governments know this. I think it's just, you know, these things take time, and it's just outstripped the pace has outstripped their ability to keep up. So it's definitely on their agenda, both domestically in Pacific Island countries, but also as a region, because, like I mentioned before, the regional approach is something that Pacific countries are working on to sort of work collectively a lot more into the future on these types of regional issues.
I'm particularly excited to be talking to you for many reasons, one of which is you both work at the Institute for Sustainable Futures. So you clearly have the answers to these incredibly complicated questions. So thinking about the future of urban growth in the Pacific, which is growing rapidly along with almost everywhere else in the world, what does the future look like for urban areas in the Pacific? Is it a good, happy future, or a really frightening future, or somewhere in between? Perhaps Anna, you could kick us off on that.
Let me gaze into my crystal ball.
I thought you had.
Look, it's really hard. I think there's a lot of good lessons to learn already, and there are a lot of good things happening. And you know, we've mentioned the policy lag, but it is something that I think is being addressed. Like I mentioned with Fiji, it acknowledges that informal settlements are an issue, and so they're aiming to work towards addressing that and bringing it into sort of national policy. I guess what's in the future, I think for me, I think our contribution is evidence-based research to inform policy and programming, and may I segue now to some work that we're doing that helps to sort of understand that. So we're currently doing some research for the Australia Pacific Climate Partnership, the support unit for the partnership, and so this is DFAT's investment into climate change into the Pacific. And it's longitudinal research that aims to understand the experiences of people in the Pacific in 4 countries, to their experiences of climate change and disaster, and the DFAT programs that are working in these communities, and understanding to what extent they're actually supporting communities themselves. The last mile is sort of what we're terming them, the communities on the ground that are experiencing the effects of climate change. And so it's a piece of research over 3 years that's really trying to explore what climate change and disasters mean for 4 communities. So the countries are Fiji, Tonga, Kiribati and Vanuatu. So they're 4 diverse communities in often fairly remote locations, in some countries anyway. And we're exploring this notion of resilience. And what I really like about this research is if you work in the space of climate change adaptation and urbanisation and maybe development in general, the term resilience is bandied around a lot, and it can mean many different things depending on what you're working on. And so it was sort of similar to us. We wanted to understand community resilience, and so we needed to unpack what that means for our research and for the communities that we were working with. And so we sort of did a lot of reading around Pacific literature and resilience and vulnerability literature, and we've come up with sort of 5 elements that really describe what a resilient community means. And so our research explores these 5 elements of resilience across the 4 countries and the 4 communities, so that we can make a contribution to not only DFAT but the other Pacific partners and Pacific governments, to really understand what makes a community resilient and what needs to change in DFAT policies and programs, but as I mentioned, other governments and other partners' policies and programs as well. So I'm a big believer that, yeah, you mentioned before about whether it's a really dire future or is it really rosy. Well, I think it can be positive, but we really need to question the way things that are done, and as much as we can, really try and implement programs that learn from the past and learn from mistakes, and learn from communities themselves, because there's a lot of resilience, like we've been talking about this whole time. And Keren's strengths-based approach is something that I think a lot of us at the Institute have taken on, because it really provides the means to lift the voices and lift the experiences of the communities that have been dealing with disasters and climate change, well, climate variability, for many, many years. So, yeah, just to sum up, I think research can be a way to try and support the changing of the way that things are done for the better.
No, thanks, Anna. And turning to you, Keren, maybe I can pick up a theme on that around learning and continuing to improve. And we had a question asking, would you say that communities in Fiji are better equipped to respond to the next cyclone? But maybe I can expand that a little bit. Tragically, of course, the world is experiencing COVID right now. People who never thought themselves to be caught up in a crisis like this of unfortunately being around the world, and maybe there's a realization of the fragility of societies more than ever before. And I think that is sadly safe to say. Do you think, sort of the same question to you, Keren, are you hopeful for an urban future in the Pacific? And are we able to continue to learn, or are we not? Things like COVID knocking us over as they have done.
Yeah, no, I think definitely there is, like to answer the person's question, are people better prepared? Definitely. You know, I think that's been a key theme that's come out of our research, but also the research that's relevant to the book chapter is people are better prepared. And as Anna talked about before with that bridge, there's, you know, people are talking about build back better. So there's you know, the time of the past where the bridge was, you know, knocked down or something happened and it was put back up. That's completely different. So people are now climate proofing infrastructure like roads, telecommunications, electricity, bridges, schools. Everything is really around just, you know, risk integration. And so I think that risk integration and thinking about that build back better mindset is really there. And so I think that from the community level, you know, communities are much better equipped to be better prepared and to be better able to respond early as well. And I think that's very important at that community level, but that also within the governance as well. And I think one of the, you know, the sort of realizations of recent disasters in the Pacific, and also another agenda within the humanitarian response, is this localization, you know, you know, which is really about local coordination and recognizing that you can't just have a myriad of kind of, you know, unique, bespoke, siloed responses. It really needs to be coordinated and supported and channeled in an effective way. And that's definitely the kind of, you know, the new way of working now, you know, compared to previous times. So, yeah, I'm quite hopeful about resilience and about the way in which people are thinking about humanitarian response, thinking about development, and, you know, that humanitarian development nexus. It's not, you know, it's not siloed anymore. Interesting in terms of COVID, you know, in the Australian response, I've heard politicians talk about build back better. I've heard politicians talk about response to Australian COVID and talking about the importance of approaches that recognise diversity in our community, and recognising that women, men, young people, different genders, transgender, gender, sexual minority groups all have different needs and responses, and that they are being recognised and addressed. And I think that's similarly the case in the international space as well.
Absolutely. And you mentioned risk integration, and it's a classic to be so focused on one hazard, another one knocks you over. So you're thinking about cyclone and an earthquake, an earthquake or a volcano erupts, as happened, of course, not so long ago. COVID itself, do you think, well, the Pacific has been mercifully spared some of the terrible things we've seen in other countries around the world. Do you think that's a success when it comes to integrating of risk within Pacific Islands that has led to a low outbreak, or something else? And I'm sorry. Yes, over to you, Keren.
Yeah, no, sure. I think it is around risk management, and I think that it was a recognition of weak health systems in countries, and I think it was a very fast response from Pacific Islanders. I think it's important to recognise that the health implications have not been realised there, but I think economic implications are still there, you know, and are being experienced, yeah, by lots and lots of communities and livelihoods being affected in the Pacific. But yeah, I think it is part of that risk integration thinking as well.
Can I just add the links to urbanisation? I think are there as well with what Keren's just mentioned, because we know that a lot of people from outer islands in the Pacific move to cities and towns for employment, and often for employment in the tourism sector. And so with tourism pretty much drawing to a halt in a lot of these countries, particularly countries like Fiji, Vanuatu, Cook Islands, I think, where tourism comprises a huge proportion of GDP, but also of jobs. And so with all those people now either sort of on hold or even, you know, laid off, I think they're either sort of, you know, without income in the city, or perhaps returning to their home islands with not much behind them. So I think it's a really tricky and very interesting situation, but something that I think Australia can sort of play a better role as a partner to the Pacific to support that, because they've been spared, as Keren said, they've been spared the health implications, but the economic implications and implications on livelihoods are quite extreme for a really large proportion of the population.
Mm. Thank you for that. We're in the closing couple of minutes, but what's your greatest hope for the work that you do? I suppose a very open question. Maybe I can start with you, Keren.
Oh, that's a good one. It's a tough one. Yeah, the greatest hope. I think the work that Anna mentioned before around evidence-based and evidence-based learning to inform policy and practice. So our research at the Institute is very applied, and we do work in partnership with local communities and local stakeholders, and really work in that way to really ensure that the findings and our outputs are fit for purpose and really do make a change. So I think that's what gives me hope, is that that we work in a way that does produce reports that don't just sit on the shelf, but actually support learning and critical reflection and basically development effectiveness.
Thank you. And Anna?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I could repeat what Keren said. I agree with all that, but also just thinking about that last mile and that community, the Pacific communities that we've visited. And my greatest hope is that the work that that we do, but also that there's a huge amount of other research going on for Pacific Islanders and with Pacific Islanders. I just hope that they are able to benefit from that, because sometimes it's sort of that research for curiosity's sake rather than research to actually create sustainable change. And so my hope is that the research is taken up and really creates positive change for resilience in the Pacific.
Great, thank you so much. Keren, Anna, I'd like to thank you very, very much indeed for a really fascinating conversation and for kicking off our series. The next session will be on the 19th of August, and the subject is climate change resilience actions in the Solomon Islands from RMIT and UNSW UN Habitat. That's going to be hosted by my colleague and co-editor Laura Bruce. So thank you, Anna, again. Thank you, Keren, and thank you very much, Jess Theakston, who's made this all happen at UNSW. So thank you all very much, and thank you for listening, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.